Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg. This time beyond Grenfell. If the UK isn't a failed state, it's certainly a frequently failing one. Time after time, we have heard apologies like this, delivered by Sir Keir Starmer in Parliament after the final report was published into the Tower Block fire, which claimed 72 lives.
I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. It should never have happened. The country failed to discharge its most fundamental duty, to protect you and your loved ones.
The chair of the Grenfell Inquiry, Sir Martin Moore-Bick, said all of the deaths were avoidable, with successive governments having ignored warnings about the safety of cladding. The Department for Communities and Local Government had embraced deregulation that weakened protections for residents. How many times have we heard similar stories about the failure of the state in its basic duty to protect citizens? Hillsborough, the infected blood scandal, Windrush, the post office Horizon fiasco. Is it too much to ask government just to do its fundamental job and to hold to account those who undermine that responsibility? I want to speak now to Michael Mansfield KC, a barrister who represented families at the Grenfell Inquiry and most of the victims at the Hillsborough Inquest as well. Michael, welcome to you. I want to talk first about Grenfell because the final report made it clear that there was widespread responsibility, contractors, local council, the tenant management organisation, but it certainly left no hiding place for government.
Well, I can do a little more than agree with all of that, because that's what it does. But if what you're wanting to pose is a question about why all this has happened, it's a much broader question. And it's one that I've been raising now, since about 2010 and maybe before that, when I published a previous book. And just before there was nearly a hung parliament and the Cameron and Liberal Democrat coalition came in. And I think in a way, the rot had begun before that, because I was addressing audiences on exactly the basis I'm speaking to you. Namely, we were a society which was morally and democratically bankrupt then, never mind now. And I think that has been evident since I said that in about 2010 and before. Since then, we've had a number of inquiries. You've mentioned some of them. I just want to pick out one because it's concluded. Those conclusions were made public earlier this year, 2024, by Sir Brian Langstaff, who chaired it. It was an excoriating criticism of the state as a whole, in the sense that governance had failed at all levels. It's a very important report because he put his finger on really the core problem here, which was way beyond the infected blood issue, which is extremely important, but it spreads into every other inquiry, including Grenfell, COVID, and all the ones you've mentioned. COVID's still going on, obviously. Why is this happening? Well, I believe it's to do with basic values that politicians have lost sight of. And I think the person who's done the most to devalue, that's what I call it, devalue our system, and put the cap on it all, was Boris Johnson. He gets a huge majority and he abuses it as if he's a megalomaniac dictator. And he's allowing, under his aegis, as it were, the values which really should underpin what we do to be actually disregarded. So you have procurement, fast track for the Tories to get in on the money game. And then we have, and people know that now. Now they're fully aware, Partygate. And everybody either trying to absolve themselves and pass it back to somebody else, just like the Grenfell situation, or they're denying it, straight denying it. So what we've had all the way through is, first authority denies it happens. Then they say, oh, well, it did happen, but I didn't know about it. Then they say, well, I did know about it, but not to that extent. And that's been going on time after time after time. And one of the things I cited it in Grenfell, I've cited it elsewhere, In the 1990s, a House of Commons or parliamentary committee was set up, a standards committee under Lord Nolan, and he prescribed 7 principles. They're called the Nolan principles. And of course, what he was trying to do was to say, we've lost our way in public life. My goodness, that was then. And of course, it's now been manifest. One of the things was candor, transparency, honesty. Now, it's not just in public organizations, it's in the private sector as well. People have felt that they can disregard the people because actually it's power that matters. I'm allowed to just say I've got a book out at the moment, which I wrote for this purpose, this precise purpose. It's entitled Power in the People, Not the People in Power. In other words, I'm trying to say to all of us, all the constituencies across the United Kingdom, we've had enough of the puppets who are parading themselves in public and pretending to, as it were, adhere to the basic, let us say, rule of law, which matters to me a great deal. But as we saw in the case of Boris Johnson, disregarding it, trying to prorogue Parliament, trying to, as it were, get out of the European Union without a vote and all the rest of it, disregarding the public. And I think the public have had enough. And I think the last election indicates the extent of disenchantment. And it's beginning again already. In other words, Keir Starmer's got to pay more attention to these values. So I think it's a devaluation that has occurred. And until we replace those, well, not replace the principles, but actually put them back in place, we're going to continue having this problem.
Indeed, but the Nolan principles themselves, Nolan started investigating, I think I'm correct in saying, in 1995.
Correct, yeah.
He himself was responding to a series of scandals in public life.
It was, yeah. So it started before that. It's been accumulating. And in fact, it's interesting that one of the phrases used in the Grenfell report by Morbick was that this was the fire, was the result of decades of failure by government, central and local, and by corporate governance and so on. And that is actually applicable across the board. We as a nation have been failed by successive governments and the failures of those in all these areas. I don't want to recite the list again. Everybody knows what they are now. I often cite Tony Benn on this. He used to say, if the ballot box or voting made a difference, they'd make it illegal. In other words, we need to know that the vote matters, that it's valued, and that we're not going to have a set of people who are more anxious on retaining their power base than in actually enacting matters which are of great concern to all of us. Not only local matters, not only cost of living, NHS, education, schools falling down and so on. They're all very important. But actually, we're part of a human race. We ought to be concerned about what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in the Sudan, what's going on in the Far East, and so on. So just because they're some thousand miles away doesn't mean to say we don't bear a responsibility. We do. So we want to reinvigorate global democratic forces. They don't always have to take the same shape, but democratic forces which in fact reflect the public. There are organizations very interestingly grown up in the last few years. One of them, which I know a bit more about, is called Compass, which is trying to do exactly that. It's traverse political boundaries and say, the real people on the real streets have got a different agenda here. And it's about reinforcing the values of society. And I thought the values that we believe in, namely the rule of law and equality of opportunity and so on. What really struck me forcibly recently was a sort of impromptu manifestation of this, that in the face of those quite horrific murders of the 3 young girls at the dance class, and then you get the right-wing forces, I'm afraid, in a sense, facilitated by certain politicians, certain rather obvious politicians, immediately blaming the people on the small boats, people coming in illegally, all that. We get all that bile. But ordinary people don't take note of that. Well, they take note of it, and what they say is, that's not us. And throughout the country, even in Southport, where it all happened, they come out on the street and they stand together, as they did during COVID, to say thank you to the nurses and the NHS who worked through it. And I think there you saw a population. And the reason why I think at that stage, the right-wing backlash faded away wasn't because Keir Starmer employed, more police officers. Of course, the police are very important. Not because they were leaning on the prosecutors to bring heavy charges and the courts to lock people up. That may have a part to play, but I'm not so sure that it's the main part. And when Keir made a speech, he didn't refer to the people, which I think is a pity, because I think the major force that changed the direction of what was getting out of hand at that point was ordinary people saying, well, we'll take hold of this. We'll show you what we stand for. And so for once, I thought, yeah, that's what we've been fighting for.
Is there a common thread here? Some people talk about the power of neoliberalism, the free market forces that have been unleashed in this country and in the West more generally since Margaret Thatcher's time, the push for deregulation, which was certainly a feature of the Grenfell tragedy. There was a conscious attempt by the Department for Communities and local government to take the supposed burden of red tape away from contractors and local council. But is that the whole story, or is there something more to it? Is there a broader question about our cultural values?
Well, the two go together. And yes, Grenfell's a very good example of what I call ideological and dogma taking over. Because, one needs to remember David Cameron was launching this policy. Really, he wanted to have a bonfire of regulations. He didn't want a risk-averse society, because that's where you get all kinds of adventure and enterprise and profit and so on. And so he created a hostile climate for anybody who was interested in fire safety, which is why Eric Pickles, of all people, who was a minister at one stage, didn't realize that fire safety might be at risk. I mean, when he gave evidence at the inquiry, people were visibly shocked, not only by what other things that he said, he clearly wasn't engaging. And it seems to me that the basic point here, that when I opened the case for some of the families in relation to the inquiry, I was aware through a newspaper, through The Guardian, they should take credit for it. An article was written in which George Monbiot had put his finger on something. On the very day of the fire, in the morning, there was a meeting of the RTI, that's the Red Tape Initiative, Oliver Letwin being one of them, and a number of others. The whole point of the meeting on that very morning was, in fact, to strip away a few more regulations to allow the building industry, construction industry, more freedom to build and all the rest of it. And it seems to me that what happened then was percolated down via local authorities, via corporations, that actually you had a license here to get away with it. It's okay, if that's what you want to do. And of course, the construction companies, as Morbic discovered, were manipulating the situation, were lying about what the product was and all the rest of it, all those things that are in the report. And in my view, that derives from one central thrust, the wrong set of values. I'm not going to put a political tag on it. I'm just going to say there's a wrong set of human values here. People were more concerned about how they can make a quick buck out of cladding, which might be cheaper or whatever it is, but less resistant to fire. So I think that the population inside them, whether they happen to be Conservative or Labour, actually, the ordinary person in whom I have considerable faith, much more faith than I do in politicians, they know what it's about. And that's why I take a further example. It stretches right through to now. Last weekend, there was another fire in East London, Dagenham. And what was the fire? It was cladding that shouldn't be on the building in the first place. They've had 7 years to get rid of this. Everybody agreed it's got to go. But they've only done about 50% of the building. I think 4,000 buildings. They've only done 50% of the buildings. And I know of families who live in the others, and they're stuck. They're imprisoned. They can't sell if they own it. They can't rent it out to anybody else. You can't get insurance companies to move in. The contractors who put it on say, not me, it's them. Buck passing yet again. So it seems to me what runs through this, Grenfell and all the others, is this adherence to a different set of values. There's an arrogance. and a contempt, in a sense, that authority, political and commercial, has, that they won't kick up a fuss. And even if they do, they're only in social housing. There you have it. It's a framework.
There is a buy-in as well, isn't there, from a lot of the mainstream media, the right-wing papers as well, who promote that agenda, particularly the agenda around cutting red tape, for example. I mean, viewed through one prism, red tape is the thing that keeps you safe in your bed at night. Viewed through another prism, the prism of the right-wing press and the Conservative Party in relation to Grenfell, red tape is the stuff that costs time and money, and we don't really want to bother with that.
That's it. That's it. And I think there's a legacy that's still there. It's very interesting that, and I'm rather grateful, that Boris seems to have evaporated at the moment, because in fact, wherever you look now, people are beginning to realize it's not just Boris, actually. It started with Margaret Thatcher in the way that she privatized human life, basically, in the way that she did it, because it's all fallen apart. And now people are talking about renationalizing transport, renationalizing water. Look what's happened to the water companies, for God's sake. What's that about? Is that about caring about the people they serve? No, they're caring about their shareholders and the amount of money that's gone there. So I say, along with a lot of other ordinary people, the shareholders better pay the money to rectify the rivers, which service us all. It's a basic natural resource, which we have polluted. So we're contributed to the climate change crisis that we're facing. And, these are the issues that ordinary people are worried about. And they need reassurance. And I think he's got a big job. I don't envy him. But on the other hand, it could be a wonderful opportunity to do I compare it to 1945, Clement Attlee. Obviously, I didn't hear the speech, but I've seen it since. I saw it quite recently. I've never seen it before. When he set out in the Central Hall, Westminster, the programme for a Labour government, which was never expected. Everybody thought it was going to be Churchill and a Tory government, but it wasn't. And the people did the right choice. They chose somebody for peacetime leadership. And Attlee was an amazing speaker. And he had the vision of, we all know what the vision was, because it's been undercut, and criticized and under-resourced. And so it's just surviving. The pillars that uphold the society to do with welfare. In other words, medical welfare, employment and housing welfare, and legal welfare as well. All of them undercut since then. So I think that was a vision. I'm not suggesting it has to be a replica of 1945, but we need a politician like that. And much as I respect Keir Starmer, which I do, I'm a fellow lawyer, I do know him, but I respect him. But I don't think so far he's set out the kind of vision that Clement Attlee had. Even if you don't agree with it, it set a standard which now is appreciated by people who, some of them are in the Conservative Party as well.
One way of instilling values in people who may be reluctant to appreciate them is to introduce laws to force people to behave in the correct way. So, for example, there have been suggestions that a duty of candour should be mandatory across all levels of government. Is that feasible? Is that desirable? Is it part of the solution to prevent these succession of tragedies happening?
I think it's a factor. I mean, I wouldn't want to say legislation is the answer. I don't think anybody's saying that, really. It is a very important factor. Firstly, because for the public, it sets an agenda. So everybody knows that that's really what should be happening, and there is a law to back it up. But it sets an agenda, it sets a standard, set in stone in a sense. You shouldn't have to do this. I mean, think about it. You have to pass a law that says you've got to tell the truth. Well, it's there already in relation to the NHS. It just is that as far as public bodies are concerned, it should cover the rest of the public arena. I think it should cover the whole of the public arena in the general sense rather than the specific.
But it's more than just telling the truth, though, isn't it? It's about telling everything that you know that may be relevant. Not telling the truth in a narrow sense, but telling it in a broader, all-encompassing sense.
Yeah, a broader sense. No, you're quite right. You're quite right. And also, allied to that, that you don't destroy your WhatsApps. You know, you have documentation which you are obliged to keep to verify the truth that you've supposedly been telling. So that it's a big obligation. Now, I'm very careful about this. Forcing people to do things isn't necessarily the right way, but on the other hand, setting an agenda is a start. And you don't want to start filling up the prisons with loads of politicians who've told lies. We have to be careful about this knee-jerk reaction to everything, which is lock them up, whatever it is. I think, you know, one has to have a more graded and reasoned approach to how you do this. And after you've passed a law, there should be an educational process in which we shouldn't be afraid. You know, it's a bit like teaching citizenship. Everybody balked at that and sort of criticized nanny state. Sorry, I think it's extremely important, schools and home, wherever, that you do have a part of a syllabus which is instilling conscience. Well, not instilling, you've got the conscience already, is actually exposing the conscience to yourself and saying, these are the values that you may matter. So one of them might be important to vote or something. Or another one might be, you know, caring for your neighbor in the general sense. Another one might be, you know, you've got to think about what you say and its effect on other people. All these values that are really pretty basic. They're not party political. They are human values. And they all can be traced back one way, or I come back to, obviously being a lawyer, come back to the United Nations Charter and the European Convention. These were extraordinary documents which were drawn up by caring lawyers. Some of the main ones were conservative lawyers at the end of the Second World War. So there's an investment here where the values we're just talking about, the candor and all the rest of it, actually are reflected in the rights and duties set out in the Charter and the conventions and the protocols that go with all this. It's a kind of structure of materials. And therefore, schools should be focusing on that and saying to, and you're not forcing people to do it, but forcing, at least getting people's attention and saying, these are things that matter just as much. Finding out, you know, where Somalia is on the geographic map, finding out what happened in 1066. There's all these other things happening now. And particularly when we're facing a society which is an instant society. You want everything in a soundbite, and you want instant communication, and you can't get, you know, people away from their smartphones, and you've got AI coming in at the side, and you've got fake news. So really, we've got a lot to face here. And I think schools and families working together have a joint responsibility here to ensure that, you know, there is a society which, because we live so closely, we've got expanding numbers all the time, much vast, you know, bigger population than 1945, bigger population. I was only born 4 years before, so it's obviously the population's mushroom like mad. But in those circumstances, you need to get people to focus on what I think are human values and a connection, rather than, it doesn't have to be put in a political context at all. It can be put in a political context at the end. And you say, well, now you've seen all these values, you can assess the politicians and see whether they actually themselves reflect these values. And if they don't vote for them.
One final question for you, Michael. Misconduct in public office is an offence that I can't remember being prosecuted. Now, I recognise that there are real dangers in bringing the law into politics because it can be used in a potentially malign or malicious way. And I'm not talking about any one particular politician or any one of these scandals in particular, but across the piece, I think people would be amazed if you look back at them and think no politician has been prosecuted for the failures that we have talked about.
Yes, I am entirely with you on that. And there is an offence. The difficulty is that prosecuting authorities are reticent, to say the least, which is why there's hardly ever been any prosecutions in relation to this. There have been one or two, but they haven't achieved much publicity and people don't know about them. The element that's difficult is that to qualify, get over the threshold, you have to demonstrate to a jury or a court that it's so bad, this particular behavior that you're saying is misconduct, that it offends the public and their relationship with the position. In other words, it demeans the position. You've been so bad in what you've done or neglect of what you've done. Now, most prosecutors find it difficult to reach that threshold that will prove that, and that they may fail. So they very rarely bring it. But in fact, just to give you an example, I chaired a people's tribunal. In other words, one set up by the people for the benefit of the people, funded by the people, on COVID. And we did it early on because we said, wait for the inquiry. Boris will he'll never get one off the ground because he doesn't want one. And we were right pretty well. It was put back, and then finally we've got one, of course. They take too long, not the fault of the inquirer. If they've got a task, they've got to do it properly. And so we had a very quick and very thorough. It can still be seen on YouTube, and there's a report that we made. I was just the main judge. The others were all very highly respected members of the medical profession saying, the government's getting it wrong. This is what should be happening right now. That's back in 2020-21. And so we brought out a report, and the reason I'm answering your question in this way is the report was entitled Misconduct in Public Office. I'm not going to run through the names. It's a very succinct set of conclusions. I dare say most of them will be echoed in the main judicial inquiry. And we gave it to the police. We said, there you are. And you know what? They gave it back. They just said, there's an inquiry, and they didn't even investigate it. So, that's the state of play at the moment. And I think the Grenfell case is so important because they're not going to be able to do that with that one. They may do different charges, but the public are right on it. Everybody remembers Grenfell because it's like the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know where you were. And it's not just knowing where you were. You probably watched it. I watched it on television, as did the family of one of the victims who I represented, who were Italian. They were in Italy watching it on television. Their daughter, trapped on the top floor, died with her fiancé. It's absolutely shocking. It's shocked so many people. They're not going to forget it. And if the police wimpingly come forward in, another 2 years, what have they been doing? 2 more years to consider. They've had 7. It'll be 10 years at the rate we're going before you get a single person anywhere near the doors of a court. And it's going to be one hell of a difficult matter. It's not straightforward at all. But the evidence is there for them to sift through. And I've got to a stage whereby they should have been in a position now. At the end of, they knew when the report was coming out, roughly. They should have been in a position to say, we have monitored this. We have got charges ready. They said at the beginning they were going to look at corporate manslaughter. Well, what have they been looking at then? That's why I think you're right to raise this question, because the law is there. And if it's never going to be used, then it's going to fall into disrepute and nobody's going to be bothered about it. But I think they've got to be bothered. And they've got to be bothered in the sense the police have got to do something much more proactive in the future. And I think they should have been instructed at the beginning to get on with it.
Michael, thank you so much for your time. Michael Mansfield KC. Before we go, just a reminder that the Byline podcast comes to you from the Byline Times, and we are part of Byline Audio. Some fantastic podcasts. You can listen to Adventures in Americana with the Byline Times editor Hardeep Matharu and the wonderful Bonnie Greer. There's Utter Bollocks with John Richardson and Otto English, which is very funny and very pertinent myth-busting. And you can also access an ad-free version of this podcast. My thanks to Michael Mansfield. I'm Adrian Goldberg. We'll see you again very soon. Do check out bylineaudio.com. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
Byline Audio.